Hold it. Yep.
There we go. All right. Okay, I guess we'll get started again. I'm Mary Lou Marino. I'm from the Office of Research Development. And I have some good news for all of you who are here this afternoon. The ability to write a winning grant proposal, or a grant proposal, is actually a learned capability. It's not something that's innate. So that means that every single one of you aspiring proposal writers can do this as well. All you have to do is to take the time to learn the skill. And because you're here today, that means that you're taking that first step, and that's really good because you've had two really good presentations today. What I'm going to do for the next 25 minutes is that I'm going to talk to you, I'm going to present to you a series of rules that myself and some colleagues have put together to help you begin to learn that skill. And you'll find that a lot of these things you've already heard this afternoon, but this is a way of putting it together in kind of an easy to remember format. So let's get started. Okay. All right. Well, of course, this would happen to me. There we go. All right, I finally found the magic button. Okay. The first rule is that you have to have a good idea. This is the most important rule. That's why it's first. If you don't have a good idea, you're not going to get funded, particularly in this competitive environment. I don't care how well you write. And writing well is very important, but you have to have a good idea. It's the basis for your proposal, and it's what your reviewers are going to be looking for. Now you say, well, Mary Lou, well, how do I know if I have a good idea? Well, there are certain characteristics of a good idea. First, the idea has to have some significance. It has to solve a problem, answer a perplexing question, or expand the knowledge base in your particular discipline. It needs to be innovative, have to be a new approach, new ideas put together, ideas in a novel way. And the other thing is that if you're looking at a significant problem, there are probably others in your field that are looking at it, and so that are also going to be interested in the same problem. So you have to, your idea has to be pretty much better because your reviewers are going to be asking about that. Another important characteristic of a good idea is that it needs to be understandable by others. If it's too complicated, if you can't explain it, then you won't be able to get funded because you have to convey it in a proposal. So that's one of the things that you need to do is to think about if you can convey this idea in an understandable way. And then something that's really important, particularly nowadays because Congress is really looking at funding agencies, is that there has to be a demonstrable payoff. That is, it has to impact, has to make a contribution to society. And Teresa went through a lot of other things in terms of your community, etc. So, you need to be, a good idea has something that contributes, because again, that's what funders are going to be looking for. And then finally, and really important thing, is it has to withstand vetting. And by that, what it means is that you should be able to present this idea to your peers, some trusted colleagues, and have them look at it and see whether they also, like you, think it's a really good idea. And that provides some good feedback. And so those are the characteristics of a good idea. Next, the next rule, start early. You've already heard this. The proposal writing takes much longer than you're ever going to think of. In Amy's presentation, you saw that there are many pieces and parts to a grant submission. Often there are 10, 15 pieces. And the actual proposal itself, even for a single investigator, can be over 100 pages. And if you have collaborators, it can be several hundred pages. So it's going to take you a lot longer than you ever think, so you have to start early. And if you look at this timeline, this is one from NIH. They're pretty prescriptive. They're pretty gung-ho about their grant writing, their proposal writing, and they suggest that you start 10 months ahead of time. And that's if it's a new program for you and you're a new proposal writer, this is probably it's a good idea to start that early. But the thing I want to point out to you is that they talk about there are 3 phases in this timeline. The first is this planning phase, where you actually get started, put together your team, think about your idea, you develop it, you think about how you're going to put this idea on paper, you refine it, etc. You vet your idea. And that can take a couple of months, particularly if you have a complicated project and if you are going to have some other collaborators, because you're going to have to work with them, etc., and kind of figuring out what you're all going to be doing. The next is the writing phase. Usually should take a month or 2 or 3 months. In this case, it's actually, they put down 4 or 5. But again, this is the time, you're not going to have just one draft, you're going to have several drafts. And if you start early, you can do a lot of the things that Teresa was talking about in terms of improving your draft. And then finally, there's this final phase, which is a submission phase. And this usually consists of, you have a good draft and that you send it out for review. You need to save time, at least a month or so, to get, a couple weeks to get information back from your reviewers. In addition, your pre-awards people need time, to get things uploaded. And as Amy talked about, the budget is a really important part to them, and they have to get it, approved. So you have to leave time for that. So again, remember, when you're putting together a proposal, don't do it at the last minute, because there's nothing worse, especially for your pre-awards people, as well as you, if you wait till the last 2 days before it goes in, because there are a lot of pieces to it. All right, rule number 3, organize before you write. Teresa talked a lot about this. You need to spend time finding out about your funder. You need to look at the request for proposal. You need to become familiar with it. What is it they're looking for? What is the funder's mission? What are the review criteria? You have to think about those things, because your project has to be presented to the reviewers within that context. So you have to understand it. And so you need to think about what you want to do within that context, as well as how they want you to put it on paper, because there are always guidelines in terms of how they want you to present the information. And they're often stylized. And you have to think about what things go where. And so when I'm starting to work on a proposal, I like to think through a number of factors, and they actually align with what we talked about in terms of what's a good idea. You need to be able to, first of all, state very simply what is the problem you want to address. And you should be able to do that in just a sentence or 2. If you can't, it's going to be hard to convey it to your reviewers. So spend some time trying to refine that so you can do that. Next, you need to be able to explain why your problem is significant. And you also have to provide proof, because your reviewers are not going to take your word for it. So you have to have some evidence. You need to do a literature review, etc. And a really good approach to this is to, if you can do your literature review such that you put it together such that the thing that you want to do is the very next step that you need to take in this area, and you're the person to do that. And so you have to think about how it is you're going to convey that. Next, you have to be able to tell your reviewer why the idea is better. So you need to think that through, and then you need to think about how you're going to put that in your proposal. And also, why is it unique and different? And then, very importantly, what are the outcomes? Because your reviewers are going to be looking at that. They want to know why they should fund this. I mean, even if it is a good idea, it has to have some tangible outcomes. And you need to know what those are, because they're going to be looking for them. Now, once you have those things, you can put together a bulleted list of what I call proposal themes. And Teresa talked a little bit about those. And I like to have like a bulleted list of the things that I want to emphasize throughout my proposal. These are the things that I want to convince the reviewer of. And I may have to remind them several times throughout the proposal. And if you understand what you want to, what your idea is, and how you kind of want to put it within the context of what the funding agency wants, then you can be really strategic about reminding the reviewer throughout the proposal about these really great qualities about your idea and what you want to do. All right. Now, Teresa talked about this. Once you've got kind of these things worked out in your head, you have to make sure that you have a good statement of what your research goal is. And then also you need to put together a series of measurable objectives and aims. And then finally, you need to think about what things do you have to do to achieve that goal through those objectives. And it's a good idea to kind of outline those things in your mind or on a piece of paper, because you have to be able to figure out how to put all these things into the format that the funding agency is asking for. Now, typically, a really good organizational style is to take the objectives that you have and then use them to organize your approach. It's really easy for a reviewer to follow from your problem statement right into the approach. And when you're thinking about the actual approach, make sure that you're thinking about both the forest and the trees. One of my pet peeves that I have when I read proposals is that oftentimes faculty, particularly scientists, get really enamored with the methods, and they'll start with the details about how they're going to do the project. And sometimes I feel like I'm a rat in a maze and I can only see a few feet in front of me. And so it's a really good idea to think about your whole project from kind of a 30,000 foot and get kind of an idea of how the different pieces fit together and actually put together a picture of your project. And actually, if you can do that, that picture actually helps you with your writing. So again, that's something else that you need to think about before you sit down. And a lot of these things that we're talking about are ways of really helping you start writing. I know that as a writer, one of the things I have a real problem with a blank page. And I can do a lot of delaying sitting actually down. But I found that if I do some of these organizational things ahead of time before I actually sit down, when I start to write, it's not so hard because, I've already done a lot of background and a lot of work, and so I can just start writing. And eventually I find that I write much better than if I just sort of sat down and started writing. Another thing to think about is, do you need preliminary studies? Because sometimes, particularly in the sciences, you need to have proof that what you want to do is going to work, and those preliminary studies really do come in handy. So you do need to make sure that you have those, because your reviewers are going to be, they're going to be skeptical, and so you have to make sure that you can answer their skepticism. And then also think about what types of potential problems that you might encounter in doing your research, because as Teresa said, you want to answer their questions. They're going to start reading, they say, oh, well, how are they going to do this? And if in the next paragraph or two you actually answer that and you say, oh, this is going to be a problem, and if I encounter that, this is what I'm going to do. So this is, those few months before you really sit down and start writing, it's important to kind of really think through the problem, think through what you want to do, what issues are you going to find, and then also, again, think about your problem, your project in a kind of a global fashion, and be able to produce a graphic of what it is you want to do. I have a good friend. She's she's been very successful in writing proposals, and what she does is that once she gets her idea and she gets her goals and objectives, then what she'll do is she'll actually sit down and do a PowerPoint, or she's going to teach she wants to present it to a class. And she actually goes through and does her series of PowerPoints. And then, she thinks through that, and then she actually uses her PowerPoints as the figures within her proposal. And she uses that as kind of the backbone and how to start writing. So those are some things that you can do before you actually sit down and write. All right, next, rule number 4. Write your problem statement next. The very first thing that you want to do is to write this problem statement. It's this section is typically the first page, page and a half of your proposal. And the thing about proposals, unlike journal articles, is they are front-loaded. Everything that the reader needs to know is actually in this section, all right? And it consists of 4 major parts. You convey your goal, your objective, the significance of what you want to do, and why, what the payoff is for actually doing your project, all right? And and sometimes, if there's room, you can put some sort of a summary of your approach, so that when the reviewer gets at the end of this, they actually have a really good idea of what it is you're going to do in your project, all right? And then the rest of it, they, just kind of fills in the gaps, okay? So in this particular, once you have this section written, then you can use it to vet your project further. You can give it to trusted colleagues. They can look at it. They can tell you what they think about your project. And then you can use that to refine it, all right? And it's also sometimes program managers at the funding agency that you're going to be applying to, it's a good idea to check in with them and talk to them about what you're thinking about, and then let them read this, and then they can tell you whether or not it fits within their program. And that's, and they're usually very nice about it, and if it doesn't, they will tell you. They may also give you some pointers on how to make it more applicable to their program. But to have this write-up, it will help you to hone in on what it is you really need to submit. Okay, start your budget next, all right? If you think about that timeline, what I'm talking about is just about the time you start writing, when you've put together this first, the problem statement, you need to do your budget. Because the budget is probably the biggest time suck of any part of the proposal. It takes much longer than you ever think, and Anne is going to talk to you about that in a little bit. It takes so much longer than you ever think. And often you will, one of the worst things to happen is to wait till the last minute to do your budget and to find out that the project that you want to do is 3 times more expensive than the money that you have. And so if you do your budget right away, as soon as you have a pretty good handle on your project, then you get an idea of whether or not it's going to fit, and then you can scale back then rather than waiting at the last minute. And then if you are working with collaborators, it can get kind of egregious if you don't work that out ahead of time, because again, they're going to want more money than you have, and you just have to kind of work it out. And if you do this before the last hour, it's very helpful. And also, your pre-awards people will love you, because this is the part of the proposal that's the most difficult for them, because they have to get it approved. And so you have to give them time, at least 10 days. And to have that, to be able to get through the approval process, because their bosses have to sign off. Their boss, Paul Lowe, has to sign off on it. In addition, if you start early, sometimes your pre-awards person will actually help you with the budget, which is really a plus. So anyway, so keep that in mind. Whoops. All right. Rule number 6, this is another really important one. Make sure you give the reviewers what they want. Now, Beth is going to talk in more detail about this, because she's going to talk about the review process, but there are really 2 groups that you have to please when you're writing your proposal. Your first main person of your audience is the program manager, and then second is the review panel. Now, the things that you need to do to make them happy. First and foremost, make sure your proposal is within the solicitation scope. This is one of the biggest reasons that proposals get rejected without review, is that they're just totally outside the scope. Sometimes it's because the submitter just didn't read the proposal. Sometimes, or excuse me, the request for proposals. Sometimes what happens is that in the process of developing the idea, what will happen is that originally the project overlapped with the scope, but as faculty get talking about it and get new ideas, it kind of gradually kind of moves away. So you need to make sure that you keep your proposal within that scope of the solicitation. Next, every RFA is going to have preparation guidelines, and you need to make sure you follow them because the funding agency is very serious about them. And if you don't, this is another way to get your proposal rejected without review. And the thing is that it's really sad when you have worked for 3 or 4 months very hard on this proposal to submit it and not to get a review. Because the review, you'll learn a lot about what the funding agency wants. And if you don't get that, that's really a loss. So make sure those things don't happen to you. The other important thing is to make sure that you write to the review criteria. Almost every RFA has them and will tell you what it is they want to hear about. And so you need to make sure that the proposal addresses them. And in particular, you need to be very blatant about it. Make sure you label them. Make sure it's easy for your reviewer to find where you're writing to those review criteria. And sometimes you can make them sections. It really depends on what they're asking for. The other thing, and Teresa has touched on this, is make sure you're kind to your reviewers. Most reviewers do this on top of their 9-to-5 job. So usually they're going to be reviewing them in the evenings, and often they'll have a stack of them. Make sure it's easy for them to read your proposal. Again, Teresa talked about this. Make sure that you have a really good organization, that the goals and objectives that you have at the beginning follow through to the end. There have been a number of proposals that I've read where that's not true, and you can't tell how the front and the back actually go together, and that's kind of bad. But also make sure that your writing is clear and you tell a good story. Think about the reviewer and what it is, that you're kind of leading them through your project, and think about that. Give them figures and other things to help them. Now, Teresa talked about skimmability, and I really like that, because make sure, and what that means is to make sure that there's a format, the format that you use when the reviewer looks at the page, they can get information very quickly without having to read it. I know for me, when I'm a reviewer, one of the worst things is when I turn the page and it's a full set of text in the tiniest print ever, and there's no break. And I kind of look at that and go, oh my gosh. And so make sure that you have things that jump out at the reviewer. In addition, many times, the reviewers are not going to review every single proposal that comes up in a review panel. And sometimes they're asked to quickly look at a proposal. And if you have this skimmability characteristic to your proposal, it really helps them. And if they can see it, and if someone else really likes it, they'll look in and say, oh yeah, this is really good. So again, keep that in mind. And then also, the person who's reviewing isn't always as an expert as you are in the area. So make sure that you don't use a lot of jargon. Okay. Number 7, have a pre-submission review plan. There are 2. It's really good to have a group of people who are going to review a draft several weeks before you submit. They should be, you should have a group of your peers. Make sure they're going to be really frank with you, and make sure you check your ego at the door, because sometimes they're going to tell you things that you don't like, but there's probably really good advice. And then also you should have someone who's really smart, who's familiar with the funding agency, who just reads it for readability and making sure that there aren't any questions. And those types of inputs are really, really good. And then another type of review that you should have is have someone that's a really good proofer that can go through and find all of the grammar and misspellings, etc., and also look at your format and just tell you some ways that you can improve it. Because remember, skimmability is a really good and important thing. All right. Rule number 8, make your abstract shine. Teresa already talked about this, how important the abstract is. like it's the portal to the entire proposal. Sometimes it's the only thing that reviewers will read. So it's important that it's really, really good. And some research has actually shown that it's the abstract and that specific aims problem statement, that very first, first few pages of your proposal, where the reviewers actually make the decision about whether or not to fund you. So it's important to have those two sections be really, really good. The rest of your proposal usually confirms what it is they've already decided. So make sure that's good. All right. Rule number 9, avoid Porter's pitfalls. Well, where did these come from? Well, there was a vice president for research named Robert Porter, who used to work at Virginia Tech University. And he, like our office, was really interested in making sure that faculty did a really good job in writing proposals. And so what he did is that he did a study or a survey of reviewers, and he asked them, okay, what are the things that really bug you when you're doing reviews? And so he put together two articles, and they're in your packet. The first one is called Give the Reviewers What They Want. And then the second one is actually a listing of the things that just really bug reviewers. And this is a condensed, sort of a summarized list. And they are poor fit. These are things that just drive reviewers crazy. Poor fit to the scope. Poor organization, weak argument, gyrating jargon, obtuse goals and objectives, an unclear work plan, deviating from the guidelines, ignoring the review criteria, weak abstract, ignoring your colleagues' comments, errors like typos and misspelling, and poor editing. Now you'll notice that if you follow the first 8 rules that I've laid out, you won't have any problems with any of these pitfalls. So that's why it's important to follow those rules. All right. And the final rule, rule number 10, and this is also important, make sure you get on a review panel. This is one of the best ways to learn what reviewers want, because you become a reviewer yourself and you're going to learn what things really bug you, all right, about proposals. So you do this and you understand, you'll get a good idea of that. In addition, you also find out what that program wants. I know a number of faculty, what they do is when a program comes out, they don't necessarily apply the first year. What they do is instead they get on a review panel and they get a good idea of what the funder wants, and then the next year is when they actually apply. So they have really good intelligence on what to do. And the thing is here is that funding agencies are always looking for reviewers. And there are, on a lot of particularly federal agencies, there'll actually be a tab or a place on their website that you can find to apply. But our office's experience is that every year in the spring, we take a group of early career faculty to DC. And one of the things that always happens is that a number of them, by the time we come back, will already have been put on review panels. So don't be shy about it. They're really interested. Now, I know a lot of you are graduate students, and so you wouldn't be able to do that quite yet. However, there are a number of things on campus, as well as for some of your professional organizations. So if you get a chance to do any type of review, take it, because it will be really helpful in writing a proposal. All right, let's go through the rules really quickly again. First of all, you need to have a good idea. You need to start early. You need to organize before you write. Write your problem statement and specific aims first before you write anything else. Start your budget next. Give the reviewers what they want. Have a pre-submission review plan. Make your abstracts shine. Avoid Porter's pitfalls. And finally, get on a review panel. Okay. Are there any questions? Okay, thank you.
Okay, my name's Ann Ulmer, and I'm a grant specialist in the College of Agriculture, and I get to talk about the budget. And we've heard a lot about that today, and I think, in my opinion, there's really, faculty members are either one way or the other. They really, really, really dislike the budget and they wait till the last minute, or they really use it as a guide and they use it as an instrument and they come early and they're like, okay, here's what I need. You know, this is the scope of the work that I want to do, and how do I make my budget, you know, work with that? And can we make this work? And so I'm actually I was over here sitting, working on a budget that's due next week that we're not going to meet our 5-day rule to pre-awards. And so that puts more weight on my shoulder to make sure that it's right, because the university has to sign off on it. And so you will make good friends with your pre-award specialist if you start early with your budget. What is a budget? I mean, I think we think about budgets personally, and maybe sometimes we don't like them when we think about a grant because we don't like budgets for ourselves. But it's really just a financial proposal, and the agencies use that to say, have they really thought out this scope of work? They want to do this enormous project and they're going to do it for $300,000. And I'm on the review panel and I can tell you, you're not going to do it for 3 times that much. And so part of it is, it's a financial proposal of how well you've thought out your project. It reflects the proposed work. It identifies expenses you expect to incur related to the project during the project period. And so we have to think about, that's what our budget is. It's not what we're going to spend. We can't spend it before the project. We have to spend it during that year or 3 years or however long that is. If we don't spend funds from a federal agency at the end of that time and we can't get an extension, we have to send it back. Agencies don't really like getting money back because then they have to figure out what to do with it, and the university doesn't like sending it back. So the more we can think about this and plan out, you'll make friends with everybody, because you'll make friends with your pre-award specialist, you'll make friends with your post-award people, with your department accountants. So I know the scientific part is really important, but if you can get the financial stuff right and figured out, it makes everyone's life much easier. Why develop a budget? It's required. Sponsors need it. The university needs it. It tells you if what you want to do is possible, given that call. I worked with a couple faculty members, and we got 2/3 probably the way through proposal, and they're like, we just can't do this. You know, USDA offers this much for this type of project, and NSF allows this much. We're just going to have to wait. We're either going to have to really cut down the scope of our project, or we're going to try to take it to NSF. And the nice thing was, it was a pretty easy transition to the National Science Foundation. But they and at least they realized it before like the drop dead date. But then there's also those things too. Okay, well, I can't fit this budget. Is there another agency that will fund similar research? Or is there another group that I can go to help fund this? It details how much you've thought about what you want to do. Who uses the budget? Really boils down to everybody uses it. The sponsor uses it. The research team uses it. Mary Lou touched on this. It's important, if you have 4 or 5 people on your research team, that they know how much money they're going to get. Because if I have a proposal and I put $10,000 in for travel and we don't talk about it, who gets to spend it? And unfortunately, sometimes it's the people who travel first, because that travel money gets spent in years 1 and 2, and then in years 3 and 4, there's no travel budget. And well, I'm the PI and I have to go to PI meetings in Washington, D.C., and there's no money left. But I still have to go to that because the agency tells me I have to. So if you can work with your pre-award specialist up front. most universities will let you. There's an option to click a button when we're routing eSign and say, we're going to set up separate accounts. So we have people from like chemical engineering, and we have somebody from biological engineering, and they're working together, and we're going to set up an account in both departments. It makes more work on the back end for SPA, but then as researchers, then you know how much your department's getting, where those funds get spent, and then there's less people trying to use those funds. Cost groups, a few people have touched on that. There's really two parts of a budget. There's direct cost and there's indirect cost. There's those things that are specifically tied to your project, your time on the project, the lab supplies you're going to use, travel to conferences, travels to meetings associated with that project. And then there's indirect cost, keeping the lights on. Paper for the printer, the accountants, your pre-award specialist that helps you get that funding. I'm funded partially through indirect cost. And so when you write a proposal, there's going to be money that you get to spend, and then there's going to be money that the university keeps to keep the university going. Some faculty members really drag their feet at including indirects and come to me and say, how can I reduce my indirect costs? And I was like, well, if you decrease your indirect costs, that hurts me. Like that hurts my ability to help you, because if we don't get indirects, you take away positions like mine to help you. And so indirect costs are just those things that can't be specifically tied to that project. Yes. There is a huge calculation that goes into the indirect cost. It's negotiated every 4 years. There's two cognizant agencies. DHHS is one of them. That's who we go with to negotiate that. But SPA has this huge calculation, and they dictate what goes into indirect and what goes into direct cost. Oh. But yeah, the agency helps that. Yes. Yes. And so it's a federally negotiated rate. And so it's not me imposing that on you. It's the university negotiating with the federal government. Here's just a more laundry list of direct costs. Subawards is one thing in there. So that's if you're having someone, say at another university doing part of the work, or but they're a distinct part of your project. And here's just some more indirect cost. We use the library, office supplies, ink pens. When they buy 50, or when they buy a pack of 12 ink pens in your department, they don't keep track of when goes to this project and when goes to that project. There's just too much costs that would go into keeping track of all of those. So here's kind of what just a general budget would look like. Direct costs are at the top. You get a total direct cost, and you get an indirect cost. The current indirect cost at K-State is 52% of modified total direct cost. That's something that you can work with your pre-award specialist on it. There's things that we don't charge direct costs, or that we don't charge indirect on: equipment, tuition for grad students. There's 4 or 5 things, any amount of subaward over $25,000. It's not something that we expect you to know. I mean, that's our job to help you with that. And so then you get the modified direct cost, and then you get the total sponsor cost. So if we made bread, what would be some direct cost of making a loaf of bread? Flour, water, sugar, yeast. Yes. Yeah, flour, vitamins, yeast. The bag, we know that we put one bag on a loaf of bread. We put one twist tie on a loaf of bread. Huh? Yeah. So, but that's the indirect cost. That's the building, because we make bread and we make rolls and we, so that's actually the building is part of the indirect cost. The overhead, the general counsel, the payroll, because I, as an employee, might work in the morning making bread, in the afternoon making rolls. So unless you make me keep a timesheet that says for the first hour I did this, and for the second hour I did this, and for the third hour I did this, it would be an indirect cost. And here's another little thing, profit. If I was Wonder Bread, I would want to make a profit. What do we know about K-State and profit? We can't make a profit. K-State, like most other higher institutions, is a nonprofit, so we cannot make a profit. We only charge the sponsor for those costs for the project. So if you work and you say, if I get this grant, it's going to take more time than I'm normally putting in, so I want to write in an extra $5,000 of my salary. Your pre-award specialist will tell you no, and pre-awards will tell you no. We can only charge for those costs associated with the project. Here's a little bit more about the indirect cost. Negotiated with the federal government every 4 years. We typically use modified total direct cost. It's currently 52%. When K-State actually calculated it was 73.27%. But when we go to negotiate it with the federal government, they gave us a rate of 52% to use for research. And so there are other rates out there. K-State has a agricultural rate to use with USDA. We have a rate for off-campus research. So if you are doing an international project where most of that research will be done off campus, that rate is 26%. So it's kind of, you have to determine where more than half of your research will be taking place. And you have to justify that to your grant specialist, and then we have to justify that to pre-award to get that approved if you don't use the full research rate. I have worked with institutions who have rates of up to like 59%. And so you have to really think about this when you're a researcher of, I need X% of direct cost to do my research. So if I think that I need $100,000 to do research, I have to look for calls that will allow me to ask for at least 152. Unallowable cost. How do we know what unallowable costs are? The university has a list. The second, salary increases, alcohol, typically is an unallowable cost. There are times where it is an allowable cost. If you were doing research on alcohol, we can buy that. But typically it's not allowed. Anything outside the scope of the project, entertainment, gifts, budgeting for equipment purchased in year 5 of a 5-year project. So the faculty member says, my grad student's gonna need a new laptop to work on this. But then they show up and they get someone else's laptop and they use it for a while. And then, okay, here we are in year 5 and we still have money to buy equipment. Well, can't I just buy it? Well, it's really not used on the project because you used existing equipment. So you have to be careful with when you buy that equipment or anything within your budget. I like to talk to faculty members about, if it was in the newspaper tomorrow morning, would you be proud of it or would you not be proud of it? Because if it shows up on the front page, K-State probably wouldn't like it. But you have to say, does this meet the newspaper test? If this shows up, can I defend it? Would I feel bad about it? Would I feel guilty about it? Or can I justify it and say, yeah, I work with people in budgets, and there is equipment. We're going to do the first 4 years of the project, and then in year 5, we have to do something, and this piece of equipment isn't needed until year 5. You write it in the budget justification of why we're going to buy this in year 5 and how we're going to use it in year 5 and how we don't need it prior to that. So part of it, the justification becomes a very important part of the budget. And then allowable costs there, how do we know? At the very bottom, the RFA will add to what is unallowable. I'm in the College of Ag, so I work a lot with USDA. There's some USDA proposals that won't allow us to put tuition for a grad student. But our college policy is that we include tuition for grad students. So I can't put that in there. And so then I have to work with a faculty member to come up with another way to find tuition for that grad student. So that's kind of a read the RFA, and your grant specialist will read it, and then we'll read it again, and we'll read it again. And it might be the day before, and we're like, hey, but we can't put this in. Here's this grant budget again. I've got this bottom line highlighted, cost share match. Do we know what cost share or match is? It's an expense of the project that the sponsor's not going to pay for. So it could be faculty time, it could be use of facilities, but it's something that someone else is going to pay for that's required to complete the project. We try to minimize cost sharing. We try to ask the sponsor for all of the funds that are going to be required to do the project. I worked with a project the other day that required one-to-one matching, and it was $1 million proposal. It was very difficult to come up with that. We actually went to several third-party companies, and they agreed to cost share on some of that. They put in money because they were going to benefit for that as well. But if you have a budget that requires matching, it's even more important to start early, because it takes a lot more effort on your part and our part to get that agreement, because I have to get the agreement, I have to get it to pre-awards, they have to approve it to include it as match on a project. At a university, the easiest thing to cost share is faculty salary. So if there's a small amount of match required, you as a faculty member, if you have a research appointment, can use part of your research time as cost share. So that's what the university likes to use most often as cost share, and it's the easiest thing to justify, or it's easier to justify, and it's easier for the post-award to monitor and then report back to the agency. Because when we say we're going to cost share, we have to report that back to the agency and say we actually put this money in. And so it's not just something that we say at proposal time that we're going to do. We actually have to account for the money that was spent, and then account for any cost share that we're required to put forth. So here's what a cost share budget would look like. You can see that we're going to cost share some salary and fringe, and then someone's going to buy some equipment. So that would actually be a cash match. Somebody would have to have funds in an account where they could spend $60,000 on equipment. The budget justification, it's just the supporting detail of the budget. So it's kind of a narrative of your budget. A lot of times all the time, the narrative of your proposal is going to have a page limit. and faculty members often run up against that page limit and they're the last minute cutting out. Depending upon your agency, the budget justification is a great way to tell the story of how you're going to spend the money. USDA does not have a page limit on their budget justification. So you shouldn't use that to go around the page limit, but it's a great place to include some extra information, some extra narrative about what that money is going to be spent for. NSF has a 5-page budget justification limit, so it's a great way to add some extra information in there to really tell the reviewers, I've thought about this and we're going to hire these 3 people, and this is, grad student 1 is going to be responsible for this, and grad student 2 is going to do this part of the project, and grad student 3 is going to do this part of the project. So they can really tell, okay, they've thought about this. They know what they're going to spend their money, how they're going to spend their money, who they're going to assign what projects to. It should also tell how we came up with that calculation. And then tell what they're going to do. So this is how we calculated the salary, and this is what that person's going to do for that money. It needs to be the same. It sounds really simple, but I see a lot of them that it's not that simple. We'll put numbers in there, and then we'll change it, and we'll change it again, and then when I go back, it doesn't add up at all. And so make it easy on your reviewers. Use the same outline. A lot of times the budget form is set, and so you put the budget into that form. Make it easy on them. Write it in the order that it's there. I mean, it seems really intuitive, and it seems like something that faculty members would do, but it's often not done that way. If match is a requirement, you justify match just the same as you do your ask. You detail what it is, how we're going to use it, and how much it's going to cost. So here's, and I get budget justifications like that. We request $10,000 annually for laboratory materials and supplies. If I'm a reviewer, do I know that everything that they want is allowable? Do I think that they've really planned their project out? Because $12,000 is quite a bit to spend on some projects. Others, I mean, I worked for a microbiologist for a while, and we would put $100,000 a year, but she would justify what she was going to buy. And then here at the end, is this going to help you managing your spending when it comes to award? Do you really know what you're going to buy each year or how it will fit into your budget? And then I get the exact opposite because I get justifications like this. I'm going to do 3,000 iterations of this, and so I need 3,000 pipette tips. A reviewer doesn't want to know that level of detail. They want to know you're going to run 30 tests, and this is what each test is going to cost. So you can have this in the background, but this is a well thought out budget justification. This is how much it's going to cost per sample. I've looked through my cost. I know what goes into each sample. I'm going to run 72 samples, and this is the amount. It really takes time. It really takes thought to put something like this together, but this really shows that you have thought about what you're going to do. Correct. So that goes back to what Amy was talking about at the in the very first presentation. With federal agencies, the rule of thumb is you can move 10% of your budget. So if you go from budget category to budget category, so we have some leeway to move budget around. Supplies are going to cost less, but travel is going to cost more. Or we decided that we were going to hire an undergraduate student to do this work. And we tried 2 undergraduate students and realized that they just don't have the skills that they need to do this project. So we're going to have to hire a grad student. And so if it is within that 10% allowable, we can move that money. If it's not, then we have to go to the federal agency and we can give them that justification. We thought undergraduates could do it, and we can't hire undergraduates to do it. So we're hired a graduate student. And so because of that, we're going to take money out. We're going to move money from whatever category to that. So yes, you can have the best planned out budget, and 90% of the time it's not going to work exactly that way. So there is leeway to move things around, but we need to plan ahead as best we can. Yes. So try to get an extra publication. So you included $2,000 for publication cost and to publish one publication. So try to get a second one related to the same project. So there are some things at the end that you can spend money on that you said you were going to publish 1 paper, but now you're going to do 2. Or you realize you got to the end and you have a little bit more money. Instead of sending just 1 grad student to that conference, you had 2 grad students on the project, send both of them that last year to a conference. You wrote in that you were going to send 1 or 2 on the project, send them both. I mean, so there are some things that totally fit within the scope of the project that you can spend those budgets on that you can defend and not feel bad about. I'm not going to read this to you, but here's a well thought out budget justification related to supplies. Budget justification, it's critical to the big picture of your project. It's the cost, how they're calculated, influenced by the institutional and sponsor policy, government regulations, and the sponsor's request for proposal. So that's all I have. If you have any questions, be happy to answer them. Yes.
How much of this budget needs to be backed up with quotes? Because I'm a reviewer, I may not know how much.
The general rule of thumb is we get quotes for equipment. And so equipment's anything over $5,000 that has a useful life of 1 year. And Mary Lou Dr. Montalone might talk about this a little bit in her review criteria. Reviewers are going to be able to look at your budget justification if they've been doing research for any time, and they're going to be able to say, they've thought this out, this is realistic, or I don't know what this person's thinking. So. Does anybody else have questions? Yeah.
So I don't mean to steal your thunder, but you very clearly warned about making sure the budget and the budget justification match, and that's key. And I've screwed that up many times myself. But the other place you have to make sure it matches is your narrative. Because if you've updated the narrative and you decide you're going to have to do 3 replicates of the testing and you only have enough for 2 in your budget, you're going to be in trouble. So, you know, the more times you tweak, make sure that you tweak all the places that that kind of thing impacts the budget.
The budget takes time. Most of the time, it takes an iteration or 2 with every faculty member. They kind of get the idea. If you have sub-awards, if you have anything difficult, start early. Read your RFA. I'm working with some faculty members right now. There are some agencies that will co-fund. And so we are applying to NSF, but we are asking USDA for funding. And so we have to abide by all of the NSF requirements for bio sketches, current and pending, everything like that. But there's a caveat at one point in the 20-page RFA that says if you are asking USDA for funding, you need to use the USDA indirect rate. And so if you miss that, it's very important because our rate for USDA, and USDA limits theirs a lot of times to 30% of total federal funds. And so you have more direct costs that you can include. But if you use the NSF rate and then they come back and make you use the USDA rate, most of the time they'll stick you to that total budget. And so then your budget's going to be lower because you're going to collect less indirects. And so read the RFA and then read it again and then read it again. I mean, they're 100 pages. They're really difficult to get through, but that's my one tidbit. I've been doing research administration for about 10 years. I've only been at K-State for 3, but read the RFA, read it again, run it by other people, ask them what they think. So, but if you don't have if you have questions, let me know. One other thing, if this is your first grant that you're writing, tell your pre-award specialist, I've never done this before. And you'll get more help. Because if you come to me and I just assume you've done an NSF, I'm going to say, okay, here's the list of everything I need and here's some target deadlines. And then you come to me and you look frazzled, like, this is the first time I've done one of these. If you would have told me, I would have done more hand-holding with you and I would have provided you more documentation. So be right up front with them and say, I need more help. I've never done this before. So, okay. Thanks.
Okay, you've gotten some great advice from everybody before me, and they've all given you the tips to how to write a good proposal. And now I'm going to talk about what happens in that black box of time after you send your proposal, like your firstborn child, out into the world to test its wings, and you hear sometime later of whether it survived or not. All right, why is that not working? There. I think I did too, yes. Okay, so how is your proposal going to be reviewed and in what order might those things occur? The short answer to that is it really depends on who's reviewing it, what agency. Is it a big federal agency like NIH or USDA or NSF, or is it a smaller private foundation? All of these, you know, the answer will vary depending on who you've sent it to. But the 4 types of review I've listed here are basically you're going to run into one or more of those. So the first phase in a big agency's review, and maybe the only phase in a tiny private agency's review, is that the staff that works there will review it, and they're going to make sure that you used the right application form, that you followed the directions that in it, and that you followed instructions. And almost everything I'm going to say for the next half hour comes down to follow the instructions. And you've already heard that a number of times. You need to read the solicitation and follow what it says. So you'll hear that again. A larger proposal agency is going to do a peer review. And so they're going to have some kind of external experts that they have contacted. They may just send them out the applications that they have, including yours, and ask them to submit some kind of review by some deadline, and then they look at what they got. Or they may convene a panel where everyone gets together either virtually or in person and discusses the proposals. Generally with the peer review, if there's a panel, all of the panel members have reviewed on their own first, and then they discuss the proposals as a group. Some agencies, like private foundations, will have one or more experts who act as consultants to them, and they're the ones that actually do the reviewing. And I mean, you just don't know what you're going to get. And then following, however, whether it was staff or whether it was peer or experts that did the sort of the content review, the agency, the funding agency, is going to do a sort of a more of a 30,000 foot view look. They're going to take a look at what the content review says. And obviously, if the content review comes back, this is not very good, then you don't have a chance. But, you know, say that the majority of the proposals that the content review says are, you know, are okay, then they're going to say, well, what works the best for us? What the most matches the scope of what we're trying to accomplish? What's our agency want to have happen from this funding call, and so on. And so there is that sort of second phase review in some of these agencies of how good a fit it is for the agency. And then getting at the questions that came up earlier about whether the budget is reviewed, yes, there may well be a separate review of the budget. And some of the things that will be scrutinized, and some of this may come out of the content review by the peers, because, you know, they can say, well, you know, the person requested, you know, 30,000 mice for this study, and that's crazy. In order to get a significant answer, they really only need 500. You know, they can say that the scope of the budget is either reasonable for the work or not. Furthermore, they're going to look at whether you've done a good job of justifying everything in your budget, as you just heard from Anne. And then, of course, they are going to ask the good old question, did you follow the guidelines? So if the maximum award is $10,000 or is $100,000 in total costs, and your budget is exceeding that, you've got a problem. And the very worst thing that can happen, and I think Mary Lou alluded to this, is for your poor, you know, firstborn child proposal to be returned to you very shortly after you submitted it without a review. I mean, there is almost nothing sadder in the universe than that. It's traumatic when that happens, because it usually means you made some major mistake. And this can happen for actually a scarily large number of reasons, such as you didn't follow the guidelines, or what you submitted is perceived, at least by the agency, as not appropriate for their mission space. As a horrifying example, I will tell you a true story of one of our faculty who submitted a proposal to the National Science Foundation last year and happened to use the word health a couple times, and it triggered the program officer to look at it and say, this is not in our scope, and it was returned without review. I mean, that's just horrible. And, you know, it could have been avoided if there'd just been a little bit more care taken about how certain things were phrased. If you miss the deadline, of course, you're probably going to get returned without review. If you are requesting a start date that's too soon after the submission deadline, chances are you're not going to make it there either. These are kind of more complicated scenarios, but they can come up. Say there's a two-phase submission process where there's a preliminary proposal required, and then they select from those and they pick, you know, maybe a quarter of the preliminary proposals to invite to come to submit a full proposal. And if you went ahead and submitted a full proposal, even if you weren't invited, that's not going to be well received. So I don't recommend doing that. And most of the agencies have pretty firm rules about not having duplicate submissions simultaneously submitted to them and to another agency. And so that's something you have to be careful of. There are some exceptions where that's allowed if you're just beginning, but by and large, it's frowned upon. Other things are really kind of duh stuff, like you didn't follow the directions about the number of pages, about the formatting, about the font. I mean, some of these agencies are really fussy, and if you use the wrong font, they're going to bounce the thing. If you use too small a font, they're going to bounce it. If your margins aren't wide enough. So, I mean, all of that seems incredibly trivial, but if you are reviewing, you know, tens of thousands of proposals, you want to review the ones that are really serious. Not responsive to the solicitation. Mary Lou alluded to this, where in the course of talking about the project, you know, the mission kind of crept, and you really got off on a tangent because you were really excited about working maybe with collaborators, and all of a sudden you're not really speaking to what the program was about. And then, of course, another really good way to get bounced is to resubmit the same thing that just got declined by that agency without changing it substantially. That never works. Okay, so how long does all this review process take? What I've given you here is information from NSF. It's pretty typical for the other big agencies. For private foundations or postdoctoral fellowship or graduate fellowship sponsors, they can be all over the map. It just depends on how big of an outfit you're talking about. But generally, they will give you an idea in the call what the turnaround time should look like. So here, if you sent something into NSF, well, phase one is prior to submission. So phase one is when NSF puts out the opportunity. And that has to be a minimum of 90 days before the deadline. That's a law. Then you prepare your proposal and you submit it, and they've got it. Okay, that's phase one, the green phase. Now in phase two, that's when it enters the black box, but here's what's happening in the black box. They're taking a look at it and seeing what it involves. They're picking appropriate reviewers. They're doing however they're going to do the peer review process, whether it's individual reviews or a panel or both. The program officer will get all the results back, and I'll talk more about how that occurs in a minute. And then they'll make a recommendation, and that recommendation will go up to the next highest level, which is the division at NSF. And the division director will review it, and this is more along the lines of, does it fit with what our goals are as an agency? And if they recommend it for funding, woohoo, now we're into the orange, phase three. It's got to go to the business wing of NSF, and they're going to look and make sure that everything is in order with the university and NSF. In other words, that you as PI or any of your co-PIs or any of your subcontractors don't have any outstanding final reports or annual reports due for other funded projects, that the university or any of the PIs are not in arrears on things like federal assurances for animal care, human subjects, etc. And so it's all that nuts and bolts stuff, but any one of those can kill your project dead before the award is made. And that is not anything you have a lot of control over, except making sure that your reviews or that your final reports and things are submitted. Once that's finally happened, then K-State will get a letter saying, woohoo, you're going to get, this grant, this is the PI, this is the amount. And then there may be some final negotiations if they want you to tweak the budget a little bit. But by and large, then the award comes in and it gets set up in sponsored projects. And now you got a grant. That's only the beginning. Of course, then you have to do the work, but that's another story. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the different agencies and what their review criteria are and how they do it. With NSF, there's two big merit review criteria that apply to every proposal, every fellowship, every cooperative agreement, everything. They look at the intellectual merit, which is the potential of the project to advance knowledge in the field. And they look at the broader impacts, which is the potential to benefit society and also to contribute to achieving certain broader objectives that NSF has decided are to society's benefit to have. Things like increased participation in science and engineering enterprise. So for intellectual merit, the panelists will be specifically asked to consider these things. They'll have to say, okay, not only is this good work, how important is it? How relatively important is it to advance knowledge? How qualified is the PI or the PI team? And if it's appropriate, in other words, if you have had previous funding, that's something you have to address in the proposal. The reviewer may comment on that. And then they're going to say, how original is this? How well written is the whole proposed activity? And another kind of a kicker that is hard for an individual PI to control is, do you have sufficient access to resources? And this can really strike fear into the hearts of people at smaller universities where they don't have, great, big, huge core facilities to do cutting edge research. So that can be a consideration. And the only way you can have any control over that as a PI at one of those institutions is to have made arrangements ahead of time to make sure that you have access to the equipment you need, even if it's at another place. Okay, how about those broader impacts? Those are daunting to many people. Sometimes you can set the project up in a way that the results of that project themselves, that is that you're going to create a whole new widget in the electronics industry, or a whole new computer program that will really revolutionize the field and benefit society. In that case, the work itself is the broader impact, or the work itself of, say, a training grant might be the broader impact. You can also build in parts of your proposal that have specific activities that are associated with broader impacts. For example, you can write in developing a new cutting edge graduate course as part of your project related to the research, or incorporating students into the research team, and not just like as paid assistants, but in really integral ways. And then you can also propose complementary activities that are still based on the research, but are not necessarily as directly related. But if it helps with, say, encouraging more people from underrepresented groups or people with disabilities or what have you to enter science and technology fields, that's also a broader impact. And so when the panels review the broader impact sections, and there are specific sections in the proposals for both of the review criteria, they're going to ask these kinds of questions about, does it really do what it's supposed to do, and how well does it do it? And also the final question there, how will those results be disseminated, because that's another thing they care about. Okay, so what do they send you? After all this reviewing is done, your panel has met, your ad hoc reviews are in, what they're going to send back to you, or more technically correct, post in Fastlane, are verbatim copies from the reviewers, and they have scores. Okay, and NSF uses a 5-letter scale: excellent, very good, good, fair, and poor. And in each of those reviews, you get a score, and then you also get a specific narrative section addressing intellectual merit, a specific narrative section addressing broader impacts, and then a summary statement, which is supposed to be their overall impression of the whole project. Ideally, this is going to include a discussion of the strengths and weaknesses in each of those areas. Of course, individual reviewers are more or less thorough, depending on just themselves and also how pressed for time they were when they put their reviews in. If your proposal went to a section that had a panel and the panel reviewed it, there also will be, excuse me, a written panel summary that comes out of the discussion of the individual reviewers at the panel. And it shouldn't be identical to the individual reviews. It should be a compilation of, sort of the overall sense of the panel, which can deviate from the individual reviews. And then what you'll get after the panel has met is that the program officer will include this context statement, which talks about the number of proposals that were reviewed for that particular competition. And that will give you a sense of kind of how well you did. Okay, what about NIH, another big agency? Well, if you learn much about NIH today, what you should learn is it's always different than NSF or USDA. NIH likes to use numbers. So they do kind of the same process. They just end up with a numerical score instead of a letter score. So first there is a peer review, which are external researchers in the discipline. So these are specialists. And each one of them is going to assign a score from 1 to 9, except in this case, 1 is the best score and 9 is no, try again later. And they are supposed to be commenting on these things: the significance of the work, the quality of the investigators, the innovative aspects of the project, the approach that's used, the environment, in other words, what kind of institution, what kind of resources do they have to do the project, and then the overall expected impact of the work. And then as appropriate, they can also comment on the budget. I've alluded to this earlier, that they may, particularly comment if something seems out of line in the budget. And they can also address issues related to research compliance. And then depending on what the solicitation was, there may be one or more solicitation-specific issues that they address. Okay, so after all the reviews have come in to the panel leader, what they're going to do is they're going to look and see sort of which ones are the top half and which ones are the bottom half. And generally, the bottom half is not discussed. They get returned without a final impact score. They'll just get not discussed when they get their reviews back. If you're in sort of the top half, you're going to get an impact score, which is calculated by the mean score for all of the individual panel reviews multiplied by 10. Why they do this, I don't know. But what you end up with then is a score between 10 and 90, where 10 is the good score and 90 is a really bad score. And then you'll get a summary statement from the panel, and that will have all of that scoring information, and it will have a percentile of where that particular proposal ranked for that study section. Okay, that's only the first step. If you pass that and you get a good score, and you'll get your scores after that point, then you still got to sit on pins and needles awaiting stage 2. Stage 2 is where the advisory council or advisory board to that particular subdivision of NIH, the institute or center, and this is going to be external scientists as well as people from the public. And they're going to review the scoring summary statements, and then they're going to see how that fits in with the priorities of that institute or center. So suppose we're talking about the National Cancer Institute. Obviously, their priorities are to find, cures for cancer, or really good screening assays, way better than anything we've got for cancer. And they've got proposals that address those things. Now they're going to say, well, maybe this, year, NIH has decided we want to focus on breast cancer, and maybe next year it's prostate cancer. Those priorities come into play when the proposals are being reviewed. And so the director of the center or institute is going to determine the final funding status, taking all that other stuff into account. And some institutes and centers, in addition to all the other numerology that's associated with NIH, will also publish what they call pay lines, which are the projected percentile level that you have to make in order to have a fundable proposal. And really all that does is scare people. Okay, what about USDA? Well, they're more like NSF. Okay, so they've got a panel manager who's usually somebody who is an established researcher like one of our faculty who's working temporarily at USDA NIFA, and they lead a panel of reviewers who are outside experts again. And they're going to generate individual written reviews and scores, and they're like the the NSF scores on that sort of 5-point qualitative scale. And then they're going to treat it a lot like NSF. They're going to discuss them. They're going to say, well, what's the consensus rating of the whole panel, and then let's rank those ones we have. So anything that gets like 5 excellence obviously is going to be at the top of the pool of ranking. And only the higher ranked ones, as you would expect, are going to get funded. And so at the end of all of that process, the PI is going to get back the panel summary, which is a written statement, the individual written reviews, and the ranking. So that's really a lot like the other agencies. So where do these agencies get these reviewers? Well, you've heard some of this earlier today too. It tends to be people that have really specific expertise in the area, but then depending on how specialized the work is, it may be that there's not everybody in the panel is going to have expertise that exactly matches yours, but they are all going to be knowledgeable in the science as, sort of writ broadly, or if it's an education proposal in the education area of the panel. And they get them from, people the program officer knows, from the references you list in your proposals, from people they know at professional societies, from searching journal articles. And then different agencies have different combinations of sort of standing regular panels that meet on a multi-year assignment. And others, even within the same agency, may be completely ad hoc, that they're brand new groups every year. And there's a lot of reasons why they do it in different ways, but that's the way. Basically, you can be a reviewer as long as you don't have a conflict of interest. And you need to declare any conflicts of interest. And these are things like, this person is in my department. That's a big conflict of interest. This person is my former postdoc, or this person is my former graduate advisor. So any kind of close tie, a co-author, a collaborator, somebody that you had a grant with 4 years ago, those are all considered conflicts. And so obviously you want to get those out of the reviewer pool so that there's not undue influence. But the second big purpose, especially for the federal agencies, is that they don't even want to cast the appearance of not being completely fair and above board. And so they want to make sure that they are, completely free of any conflicts of interest in the process, because protecting the integrity of the peer review system is very critical in the minds of all of the federal funding agencies, especially in this day and age. Okay, so who makes the final funding decisions? It's it's the big shots. It's the program directors, it's the program leaders at USDA, it's the directors of the centers and institutes at NIH. It's, whoever at the smaller private agencies. You heard something about the actual awards from both Amy and Anne, and so I won't get into a lot of that, but as I said before, it's the grants and agreements units of the agencies that make those awards, and they have to make sure that everything is ready to go at the institution that you're at. So chances are you submit your proposal, it gets reviewed, you're happy it wasn't returned without review, and now you get your scores back, and chances are you're going to get declined. I mean, that's just the reality. Most proposals are declined. The funding rate at federal agencies is anywhere from 8% to maybe 30%, maybe. It depends on the area. So that means, realistically, a majority, sometimes a large majority of the proposals are declined. So why is that? Well, it wasn't competitive. It had maybe some flaws or issues that they identified. A much more frequent reason is the bottom one. They had a lot of good proposals that they got, but they just didn't have enough money to fund them all. And that's the sad reality. So the big question that many people have when they get a decline is, well, should I A, slash my risk, B, quit science, C, revise and resubmit? The correct answer is C. Talk to people though first. Read the reviews. When you get them, you're going to want to not ever read them again, but do read them. Then put them in your desk drawer and take them out in a couple weeks. And by then, the open wound in your heart will have hopefully healed enough that you can read them and you can take them seriously. I mean, it is painful. Getting your work declined is painful. You think it's bad getting a bad grade in a class. No, it's far worse getting a grant declined. So read them carefully and see what they say. Okay, do they really, really hate your idea? Did 2 of the 3 reviewers like it and 1 person hated it? See what they said about it. See what the summary statement says. Maybe send an email to the program officer and ask if you can discuss it. Do not do that on the first day when you're really mad. Wait until you've had a chance to digest the reviews. So if they've addressed a glaring weakness, like you don't have enough preliminary data, okay, well, that's obvious. What you need to do is go back and figure out how you're going to get the preliminary data. But if they think your idea just plain won't work, well, then you're going to have to come up with a plan B in order to convince someone that it may work, which is either an alternative approach or preliminary data. So, your approach to this really depends on what your reviews say. And so the only reason you want to revise and resubmit is if you can identify a way to improve the thing. Okay, if you can't come up with any way to improve it, or you get a decline because it's just not in the scope of the agency, find a different agency or greatly change your proposal, because that one's probably not going to work. But don't assume that just because you got 1 decline that you are forever a failure. Revise and resubmit. Do it again. Do it again. And sooner or later, you'll get funded. So why are agencies likely to fund a competitive proposal? Because it was well written, because they were convinced it would have a high impact in the field. Some competitions are specific for particular kinds of investigators, like young investigators. And so you need to stand out in that group. It fits the program portfolio that the agency has. Sometimes you can get funded because you can show there's going to be a big impact on your institution or on your state. This particularly comes into play if you're applying to things like EPSCoR, where that's kind of federal welfare for states that don't have a lot of funding. And we're in most of those EPSCoR programs. The only one we're not is USDA, surprise. Sometimes there's diversity issues. They want to have a diverse portfolio. And you know, you don't just have to think of race and ethnicity. Diversity takes many forms. So, you know, there's a lot of good reasons why you might be successful. And it really comes down to the difference between a good proposal and a competitive proposal. Okay, at a minimum, what you submit, if it has a chance at funding, has to be a good proposal. In other words, it's got a good idea, you articulated it well, you clearly described the methods, evaluating the results, and then disseminating them. But a competitive proposal is what's going to get funded. And it is a good proposal, but it's also got other things going for it. And that elusive fit is frequently one of them. That's the responsive to the program announcement. And so I'm going to close with these thoughts. The things that make your proposals competitive are good ideas that you succinctly and clearly expressed. You showed that you have expertise in the area. You pick the appropriate methodology and you have access to the instrumentation you need to do it. You talk about how this fits in your future plans. You rationalized it clearly in terms of the existing literature. You didn't describe, 10 years worth of work in a 5-year proposal. You provided enough detail to make them believe in you, and that you showed you had a critical approach to the work and interpreting it. And so I say, go forth and write proposals, and good luck.
Okay, we have a couple of announcements before we leave. Do you have any questions for Dr. Beth first? Okay, a couple of announcements first. First, let's thank all the speakers for providing very valuable information. And also, let's thank the Vice President of Research Office for putting together such a wonderful workshop. So, okay. And last, we have some extra cookies in the back. Please take them. Your friends or hardworking undergrad students will really appreciate that. So thank you very much. Thanks for coming.
Okay. We're keep sending emails. Are you new to the class? About half.